Well, it's recording, yeah.
Okay, thanks. So, welcome everybody to this extremely well attended talk. It does say get into 4 groups, but I think probably 2 groups will suffice, so we've got 3 and 3, that's fine. Can you please go to this web address, piaf.com/survey, because we'll do one at the end as well and see if anyone changes their mind.
So we've got these silos.
Let's put our hands up and just say what do you think you are as a person. So not your job title, but internally you. What do you know, from what you think architecture and engineering is, what do you think you are? So during this, we're going to be presenting some thoughts on what the difference between architecture and engineering is, but it's very much a what do you think architecture and engineering is. So I'll give you some steers of what pragmatic thinks enterprise architecture and engineering is. You don't have to agree with them. It's just there to kind of set some context. Just so you know who I am, I'm Kevin Smith. I wrote my first program in 1978, so I've been in the industry about 40 years now. The last 15 or so has been in enterprise architecture, and 2008, so just coming up to 10 years, the Pragmatic Enterprise Architecture Framework was launched, which is the 20% of the fundamentals you need to get right to get 80% of the benefit. So what we'll be doing is I'll give you a brief introduction and give you some ideas of what we think the difference between architecture and engineering is. Then let you have a bit of a workshop for 10 minutes or so. After that, I'm going to give you a bit more pragmatic thinking of what we think the differences are between architecture and engineering. Then we're going to have a lot more time to have a workshop for you to discuss jointly together, in your groups rather. And then we'll get one person from each group to present what that group has decided the differences are. And then at the end I'll give some final comments. When you're thinking about what is enterprise architecture and what is architecture and what is engineering, I think it's helpful to not just think of one and think, right, what can I write down about architecture or what can I write down about engineering? Try to think of contrast. So what does an architect do versus an engineer? How does an architect think versus an engineer? So if you can write in pairs, I think that would be helpful. So from Pragmatic's point of view, which is basically my point of view, over 40 years of experience, which could be wrong, architecture and engineering I see as kind of 2 sides of the same coin. You can't really have one without the other. They both benefit each other, but they're both fundamentally different, but they're very interrelated. What we tend to think, from a pragmatic point of view, is we architect the whole. So architecture is about the broad things, and then engineering is about engineering parts of that architecture, which might take a long time to do. So this is one of the problems when we talk about architecting with business leaders who don't understand architecture, is that they think, oh, because you're architecting the whole architecture of the enterprise, that means we're changing the entire enterprise. We don't have money and time to do that. Well, of course, it's not. What we're doing is architecting the enterprise, but we're going to engineer it tactically over time. So architecture is kind of horizontal, engineering is kind of vertical. Just from my point of view, I think my brain is an architect's brain and an engineer's brain. I think earlier on I was more an engineer, and as I grew older I became more an architectural kind of thinker. So here's some kind of guide. So we think architecture is more about asking the why question. Why are we doing this? Oh, we're doing it because of that reason. Well, why? Why is that the reason? It's about understanding things, asking questions and thinking about things, versus engineering, we think, is more about the how, the doing things, the creating solutions, talking and doing things. And one of the lines is that architecture finishes when there's nothing more to take away, and engineering finishes when there's nothing more to add. So actually, if you think about building architecture is actually not the physical building. It's the patterns that was used to create the building, that's part of the architecture. But the architecture of a building is the spaces, actually. It's not the physical, it's the spaces that have been created. So it's about taking things away. Imagine starting with a solid object and taking things away to create volume of spaces, whereas engineering is about building walls and things like that. So, over to you. Do you have any questions, first of all, on what I've what my thoughts about the difference between architecture and engineering is? Right. So, we don't actually have a whiteboard. So, can you get into your groups and start having a bit of a chat? Not for a huge amount of time, maybe 10 minutes. Maybe each go around each of your tables and each person explains to the other person what maybe they think the difference between architecture and engineering is. Then we'll get back together and I'll give you some more pragmatic thinking.
When we've worked out the difference, what will we achieve?
Understanding, which you could say
Yes,
architecture.
I'm just trying to understand what the outcome will be when we've finished working out what the difference is.
The outcome will be that we will know what the difference is. I think in many why is that important?
Yes.
That's a very good question, which I should have covered. I didn't cover. The reason this is important, I think, is because they are literally fundamentally different things, very closely related, but fundamentally different things, requiring different ways of thinking, different ways of working, and looking at different things in different ways. In most organisations, from what I've seen through my professional life, is there's great confusion between the job of an architect and the job of an engineer. So what's happening is companies are employing engineers and calling them architects and asking them to do architectural things, when in fact they're not architects. They don't think like an architect, they think like an engineer, and therefore they do engineering designs rather than architectural designs. So this question, I believe, is utterly fundamental to allowing the transformation domain in companies to work correctly. Can you imagine what was happening in the building industry if we had engineers who were called architects? So you had engineers doing architectural drawings, and you imagine what would happen if you had architects doing engineering drawings. It would just be a complete and utter mess. But that generally, I think, is what happens in most enterprises. It's just a mess. People are doing things.
I disagree. I mean, our engineers is a well-defined. We're an asset-heavy industry. Our engineers build physical assets and control performance characteristics of them. The architects are more business IT-led. I don't see the same confusion actually. Just personally, in my
every time, what I'm always talking about are the problems in the enterprise transformation domain. That's why we need frameworks, that's why we need best practice and all the rest of it. Those companies that are wonderful companies, who absolutely, completely understand the difference between architecture and engineering, then there's no point in them thinking about the difference because they already know the difference and everything is, there is no problems. So I'm sure there are examples where companies and people working in a company know the difference between architecture and engineering. In my experience, I've not really seen that.
Is the context of this software architectures and enterprise architectures, not real architecture, building architectures? The word architecture engineering for a building is different from software engineering.
Is it?
And software architecture, for example.
Is it? At the fundamental level, is it different?
really sorry, I'm not trying to figure out. I'm just going to try the next session. It's more data architecture.
That's another good question. So when we're talking about engineering,
I think they deal with different subjects. So in that regard, there might be conceptual overlaps and similarities, but the subject is different. So
correct.
you know,
So I'm asking
when you
you.
look at Sydney Opera House, it's easy to see the architecture. Whereas,
Yeah, but what-
so you can begin to understand the difference between the architect and the engineer's contribution to that project. Because the engineer had to work out how to fulfill the architect's concept.
So what we're talking about here is, I want to be domain unspecific.
Right.
think about the problem in whatever domain you want to think about it as. But when you write something down, this is how I would describe our architecture, and this I would describe engineering. Let's say you're thinking about software architecture, application architecture. Once you've written that down, say to yourself, would that also apply to buildings? Would it apply to aircraft? Would it apply to enterprises? Because if it doesn't, then you're looking at a domain-specific difference, not a difference between architecture and engineering. So I want to get the domains out of it. Fundamentally, I want organisations to understand, or management to understand the difference between architecture and engineering. Don't want to talk to them about enterprise architecture, or data architecture, or software engineering, or any of those things. This fundamental difference, where architecture, we say, is a way of thinking about something that's complex and volatile, because you just can't think, you have to think it
Like the gentleman's just saying, in certain businesses that's really obvious, and in certain other businesses it's really not very obvious. And it depends on the domain that you're in. In some domains it's very obvious, and in other domains it's not. Like if you're building a road, it's very tangible.
Well, yeah, I've never been very happy with this attempting to map building architecture against IT
Or not.
architecture. It doesn't.
That's why
That is not a good analogy as far as I'm concerned.
Correct.
If you go back to some of the early papers on McKinsey, what they talked about was town planning and planning Paris and so on, with the Haussmann boulevards and things. And that, I think, is a better analogy for enterprise architecture, where you're creating a broad suite, a pattern of rules and so on that will be obeyed into the future. And the average architect, I don't think, does that. The average building architect.
Okay, once again, think about whatever domain you want to think about. Whatever domain you're happy. If you're happy thinking about data architecture, and think to yourself, what's the difference between data architecture and data engineering? Then think in terms of data.
And I suppose one of the things in context, because when you look at architecture and what is an architect, is the Chartered Institute for Architecture, that they clearly define how that term can be used. And they recognise within the IT industry that terms such as enterprise architect exist, and that there's different domain architectures. So from that sort of perspective, I think just architecture and engineering, the context would help, because recognising the typical domains that you see across business, enterprise, information, technology and stuff like that. I think it's more of a context thing, but I can definitely see the difference between the depth and the breadth across both, because if you use the house analogy, is that if you've got an engineer that's fantastic at making stairs, how do you know that they're good at levelling off with the floor and it's going to get the right amount of light and space coming in through windows, sort of thing. And I also see that within the broader sort of EA space, if we're looking at what is enterprise architecture, when you're starting to look at capabilities, processes, and actually understanding what those business needs are and mapping them through to something from a technology perspective, that has the right information flow to get it to the right people at the right time in the right place.
Yeah.
So for me, I'm slightly uncomfortable with the context.
What context would you like?
I suppose a
Do you
more
want to
broad...
think in terms of enterprise architecture?
I think
Think in
that,
terms of enterprise
yeah.
architecture. Like I say, decide on what domain you want to think. What context do you want? Do you want to think in terms of building architecture? Do you want to think in terms of enterprise architecture, data architecture, software architecture? I don't mind. What we're trying to get at is the fundamentals of architecture. And hopefully, when we define the fundamentals of architecture in software, that will inform us of what the fundamentals of architecture are in data architecture. And what we understand the fundamentals of the difference between data architecture and data engineering, that will inform us to understand enterprise architecture and enterprise engineering.
Sure. So I think really
Do
then
you
from...
think there's a right answer to this?
Sorry?
Do you think that there's a right answer to this?
I think
We'll come across through this process.
I think there are fundamental differences, and there must be some way of expressing those fundamental differences between architecture and engineering. And if you decide,
No, I agree with that.
if people decide that architecture and like Zachman thinks architecture and engineering is basically the same thing, because he uses the words interchangeably, you said in the
Yeah.
course I attended. I think that's really bad because we have engineers doing the job of architects in companies, and we have architects doing the jobs of engineers, and that's just bad. No one benefits, especially the people doing those jobs.
I think
What
within
if
the
there's-
IT.
what if-
Just to add, actually, because of this very problem, I've actually, for my sins wearing my academic hat, my practitioner hat, is I've actually done some work into relating enterprise architecture, enterprise modelling. So we've tried to come up with a common framework to at least understand the similarities and the difference between them. And where, for instance, an engineer might use the term decomposition and composition, an architect might think in terms of conceptual architecture, physical, logical architecture, or design. But what we try to do is identify basically what the similarities are and the differences are, and where you can achieve a common understanding. Because certainly my experience has been that you can have endless discussions about the subject and get absolutely nowhere with it. And I think the trick is to find what's the shared meaning between an engineer's perspective and an architect's perspective. And then you say, I might, for instance, if I'm thinking software engineering, I might think object orientation, I might think types and subtypes. If I'm an engineer, I might think composition and decompositions. I've got for instance, a car consists of wheels and steering wheels and doors and all the rest of it. The difference between how an engineer breaks something down and how an architect breaks something down, you can instantly see that stop disagreeing one another, because, for instance, you'll get, well, you're not applying Vygots's substitution principle, means you have types and subtypes, and an engineer would say, well, that's not my point. It's about taking a unit of interest and what's its constituent parts and decomposition. Breaking it down into its, and then what you do is you decompose and then recompose, and then you
So
start to get a
maybe-
common understanding.
So maybe one of the differences between architects and engineers is that engineers decompose things into smaller and smaller pieces, but architects compose things into bigger and bigger things. Maybe that's one of the differences you could write down.
Yeah.
Can I ask you one question? Put your hand up if you think understanding the difference between engineering and architecture is important
For a business.
for a
yes.
business and for people working in a business.
Absolutely.
So, you don't. Would you like to understand why? I don't want to put you on the spot, but I really would like to understand.
I wasn't sure whether I should put my hand up or not. My thinking has gone on a slightly different track, which is that the classic problem with this term enterprise architecture, and
I'm not
also,
talking about enterprise architecture.
and also with models like TOGAF, is that we focus on, is that we're in a computing context, and enterprise architecture is not software architecture. And most people who are enterprise architects probably come up through the IT background, whereas arguably they should be organisational design people from HR or from process or something else. So that both these terms, architecture and engineering, here are extremely fluffy. And
Exactly.
I think potentially you have to break them down before you can do your comparison. Because I think just to say there are things we can say about all architecture that are different from things we say about all engineering. I suspect we'll end up with
Are you an
with an
architect?
empty set.
Are you an architect?
Yeah.
Okay, so how many people here are architects? Right. Well, as architects, I think you understand the difference between talking about something and abstracting that something to another level, and the power that you get by abstracting that thing to another level, a higher level.
But
Okay.
most of the time,
Wait.
most of the time
Hang on.
I'm a solution
Hang
architect,
on.
which I would say is engineering.
So, as architects, I would expect you to understand why I don't want to talk about enterprise architecture, which is at this level. I want to talk about architecture. Let's understand the fundamentals of architecture. If it helps you to think about the fundamentals of architecture by thinking in different domains like IT, enterprise, solution, whatever, then fine. But it's powerful if we can If we can define the difference between architecture and engineering, then we have defined the difference between solution architecture, solution engineering, enterprise architecture, enterprise engineering, application architecture, application engineering, data architecture, data engineering. So as architects, that's what you do. So I'm kind of asking you to be a bit architectural in your thinking.
I think that the thing is what we're doing is discussing, we're having a sort of category discussion, which is a very academic sort of or abstract kind of thing. And then we're trying to relate it to the real world, where we know that the job is something like to take an aspiration, a vision of the business, and take it all the way down to something that works. It's a solution that's actually operational and works. And that journey from vision to something that works doesn't just go architecture, engineering. It goes conceptual, logical, physical, design, build, deliver, change, manage the change, get it working, realise the benefits, then go around the loop again. And that's got lots of activities, many, perhaps 20 or 30 different types of activities, 20 or 30 different types of skills, of which architecture is a bit, engineering is a bit, but there's other ones as well.
That's the trick, actually, because the thing is that you're coming in from those different disciplines, but what you want to create, how can I put it to work? From the conceptual, from an engineering knowledge, how can you bring engineering knowledge to bear on it, architectural knowledge to bear into it, and then how can you create a method or a framework that can actually apply it to real projects, and finding what the common basis of those terms are. You can, I'd say successfully, advisedly, but you can, to a good extent, start to get the benefits of both without getting into sort of ethereal discussions about what is where, with practical examples that demonstrate how it can work. So I'm sorry, I'm just probably stealing a bit of thunder from my session this afternoon, but the plan is that we start to bring them together, we put them in an actual project, we see what the similarities and differences, because I'm from an enterprise architecture background, but I work with a guy who's a systems engineering background. And what we've done is to try and find what the differences are and say, right, let's have, in this project, how do we realise it? How can you, for instance, apply the principles of composition and decomposition in this conceptual, contextual sense as well? And that's, when you start to see it working, that's when you really start to see the benefit of bringing in architecture. And I don't mean to sort of it's just my own personal experiences of working with this very problem.
The problem we're experiencing here is this question is a very difficult question. I think I've got an answer to it later on, which I'll show you, but I don't want to show you my answer and then you just go, oh yeah. I want you to think about it. And the fact that you're finding it difficult, I think you're finding it difficult, that's the point.
I think with this question is that I think there's very good points of view from different angles around this, and it's those words all up there really mean and relate to the audience in different ways. If you were to have building engineers and building architects, they would have a different view to people that have a business and IT background, because IT being a younger...
You're thinking at the domain level. Physically, doing building architecture and doing software architecture are completely different, okay? But the discipline of architecture that both are using is the same.
Agreed.
It's architecture.
Absolutely agreed. And I think with IT being such a young industry and how we've seen things evolve from mainframes and things over the years, and how we've seen architecture or the role architect mature and develop, an observation that I've seen across many industries now is that depending on the size and complexity of the organisation, architecture serves a different value to those organisations, depending on what it is they're actually trying to do. From a purist perspective, in a more mature organisation, the architecture being able to create that fluid continuum from an idea or vision all the way down something that continues, that is very different to the engineering that you would see in that sort of organisation versus say, a start-up company, which all that they're caring about is being able to develop engineered code because they're trying to spin up microservices as fast as possible.
Okay. So what I would say to that is, a difference between architecture and engineering is when you are when you are not volatile and not complex, which is a startup, they're not volatile, they're not changing rapidly, and they're not complex because nothing exists.
Yeah.
You don't need architecture, because architecture helps you deal with complexity and the volatility of change of something.
I agree.
So that's another difference you could write there.
Yeah, I think one of the key attributes of the architect is to understand how the thing you're designing has to accommodate change in its environment as it's going forward. Whereas the engineer, the engineer's going to design the solution to that, but doesn't have to think of what the areas of resilience need to be. So does it need to stand up to strong winds? It's an architectural question. The engineering is how will I design it so that it will stand up to certain strong winds that the architect has specified. So it's change. And so an engineer is typically interested in efficiency and effectiveness, whereas the architectural additional, they're also interested in efficiency and effectiveness. The additional architectural dimension is time, change.
I'm going to step out of this conversation just for 5 minutes because I want you all to discuss, because I don't want this to be you challenging me and me telling you. I'm going to give you my views in a little while. I want you to discuss and argue against each
Are
other.
we in one group or are we in two?
I think you can be in one group now, to be honest.
Can we all move to one table then?
Any chance I can stay?
Yes, I'll let
There's some outside, isn't there? If there's some outside, I left mine on the train.
There's a whole box of pens.
Is there a whole box of pens outside?
I'll go bring one to you.
You're going to get a whiteboard as well. For some reason.
I think there's a-
Oh, we're going to go on.
Yeah, Oh, is that brandy one?
I'll go scratch it.
Yeah, interesting. I don't know, I came from an engineering background.
Right.
Only last year I went into the enterprise architecture team.
Sorry. Can we introduce something?
Yes, I know.
Sure. You start, because
You want to companies as well? Okay. So Paul Stevens, I'm enterprise architect, and I say that because I don't cover all the four disciplines in terms of the I look purely at infrastructure and technology because that's a huge topic for us. And
Who's us?
Uniper, so they're a power generation company. They were spin off from
So
Uniper. Juniper about today.
No. That's
And we split away from E.ON about 2 years ago. So it's all the dirty bits. Coal.
You've got all the dirty bits.
Yeah. The job I was given was basically how do you take a very complex infrastructure servicing 75,000 users. It's very hard to break it up and create effectively 2 new ones. One company still running.
Yeah.
So the whole of the town planner, that's what I want to do. I have to look at, from a town planner's perspective, what we need to have to actually achieve separate infrastructure from the original company. I'll give you, the points I always think about in this kind of job is that the architect side of it has to look at the what we need to do and why we do it. And then think about the money aspect. The how.
The introductions and then come back to the
Yeah,
answer.
so a good question. The how is the engineering, how we do it together.
Okay,
So,
We're going to get to that. We're trying to do introduction.
yeah.
Well, we've got 40 minutes, so I'll skip the introductions and just get into the discussion.
Just very briefly, yes.
John Estelle, contract architect, mainly solution, sometimes enterprise, telco space.
Simon Jewell, and I work for Scottish Widows as an enterprise architect, Gemini, Circuit Consulting, Avanar, and now I'm contracting, I'm really enjoying it. Just finished a contract with BT, so particularly interested in the top part of architecture, where you're translating from the business aspiration to the architectural capabilities required before you go into the design and the solution architecture. That's quite an interesting question to me.
Simon Polovina. I work both as an academic and a practitioner. I come from a sort of SAP enterprise architecture background, but I'm also interested in what I call conceptual architecture, understanding, this uses technical terms, the ontology, which touches on this subject. So I work both as an academic and a practitioner.
Okay, Chris Banks, I'm an enterprise architect with a domain focus in technology around digital workplace for a global insurance company. Over the past 10 years or so, I've worked in EA, SA roles across public, private sector, and industries, also doing some stuff in government. Prior to that, about 10 years in service operations management, started in systems engineering.
Right, let's go.
I think that for me, the architect in this kind of context is looking across multiple systems, and that's kind of it may not be 100% accurate, but the architect is looking across multiple systems, and one of their jobs is to maximise the value of the investment that you've already got in your estate and to maintain it going forward and so on and so on. Whereas engineering, very often in a simple sense, we tend to think about that as building one system or making changes to one system and maybe to a few other neighbouring systems, but it's a much more focused on the end result.
I suppose from my perspective at times, and what am I thinking? I think an architecture thinks in terms of layers or types. Bigger objects broken down into little objects and subtypes. So, whereas an engineer looks at the idea of breaking things down into its constituent parts. So there's a term that I borrow from object orientation, which I think that architecture thinks in terms of isers. Yeah? So a manager is an employee, that sort of thing. Whereas an engineer thinks in terms of I'm an employee, what sort of things do I do? What's my role, name, and that sort of thing. And I think that's been, in my experience, one of the difficulties. It's because, for me anyway, it's because of the discipline, I think, of engineering and architecture, is you're wired to think in slightly different ways. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that I've had.
I think those layers and types, one of the things I've been looking at is a capability modelling approach to architecture. And I think there's sort of three bits or three domains that you think about as an architect. There's what capabilities the business needs in order to achieve what it wants to achieve. There's what are the services or capabilities logical that are needed to facilitate that. And then the engineering bit is how you design that. And to give you an example, in the building, when you're building, I've just been doing an extension on my house. So the first bit is the fact that I want to go to the wall and press the switch and the light comes on, and press this switch and the blinds close. The architecture of that was I need power, and I need water, and I need drainage, and I need rainwater, and I need a 5-amp circuit, and I need a 13-amp circuit. So I've got all these networks which are going to go out and connect everything together, which underpin the fact that I can go to the wall and press the switch. And my experience is that that's the architecture. If you don't get that bit right, then when you come to engineer it, you engineer it in the wrong sequence, put down the paving slabs before you put your rainwater network in. And then you're relying on the engineer to engineer those components that you built. So, the guy who has to engineer the actual frame of the building You know, he has a whole range of skills and capabilities that I don't need to have as the architect, because I'm offloading all of that to that engineer.
So I did a similar thing. So I had an extension on my house. We used not using software here. So I looked in terms of I wanted the extension to look like it was part of the original house. So the brick, the space itself, I want, because it was just a single story, I wanted to have the roof for it as part of the roof because it's quite narrow in space. I wanted to have so that when you walked in, you automatically looked up. You didn't look at how narrow the room was. You actually looked at how big it is, how big it was in terms. And then start with obviously power and monitor and other utilities into the room. But then that's the limit of the skill I had. And then I had to call a real building architect to say, is it possible to do that in the space I've got?
You see, I think what you were talking about in terms of electrical is not architecture, it's engineering.
No, it's definitely,
Well,
it's definitely.
let me explain what, I know what you
The
think,
reason
let me
why-
explain why I think that.
The reason why it's architectural is that the architect has to consider the networks and what's connected to all the networks.
Okay, so let me explain.
Hold on, the engineer knows how to build the networks and knows how to connect to them. So I employed electricians to create the network, but I was the one who said there's going to be a switch here and there's going to be something that happens out there. When I press the switch, that happens. The engineer is the one who connects the network to the main, and they do all the engineering of that. But the architecture is that there has to be power. There has
So
to be
maybe we're
water,
talking
there has
across
to be rain.
purposes,
Yeah,
because
I think we are.
I'm building a house, so I designed the house, and I work with an architect to architect the house, and I work with the engineers that engineered the house. So I know a little bit about the subject like you, gone through the same process. But while I was going through that process, because I'm always thinking about what's the difference between architecture and engineering, I was very interested to go through that process with my mind going, is this architecture? Now are we doing engineering now? And it was very clear that the why, or what was required, so for example, like you said, a switch here and a switch there, and